Welcome back to the Badass Podcasting and Audio YouTube series. Last time we talked about finding a character compressor to not only straighten out your vocal levels, but also give it some interesting tones and some characteristics that make you uniquely you. Now, you may have heard of the plugin type called a limiter before, and sometimes you hear something a compressor limiter. What's the difference between a compressor and a limiter? A compressor does, as we've mentioned a couple times, what we need it to do when we're trying to even out audio levels, which is reduce the peaks and bring up the lower volume parts to try and equalize the volume levels or inconsistencies. A limiter, at least for our purposes, is meant to make sure that nothing exceeds a certain level. So it really is about chopping off the peaks, and it chops them off very, very quickly. Most limiters are very fast attack, fast release, very high ratio, and they're very fast acting, and they have a really high threshold. So they only really kick in at the very, very top of the highest peaks. So let's see one in action. Most of your DAWs will come with a very serviceable limiter. I recommend that you set the threshold, which is sometimes called the output ceiling or the brick wall setting, at not 0 decibels, because 0 decibels is where it distorts, but either minus 0.2 all the way down to minus 1.0 decibels. The difference depends on what you're going to do with it after. If you're going to do some mastering or equalization on it after the fact, leave a little bit of room for that processing. In fact, negative 1 decibels might not be enough. But keep in mind also that sometimes submitting your podcast, your audio files to hosts, they will sometimes apply normalization or other kinds of filtering to it to try and make all podcasts sound the same. And if you don't have enough headroom or ceiling, if you will, to make those changes, your audio file won't be usable, or it will distort and it won't sound good. However, if you're publishing directly to, let's say, something like SoundCloud, YouTube, or a podcasting host that doesn't process audio, you can easily get away with, I usually use negative 0.5. So let's do that, and let's kick it in, and let's watch it work. Let's take a look at the gain reduction meters and see what it's doing. Hello, everybody. Chris Williams here. I am recording a podcast today using Did you notice they're doing nothing at all? The reason for that is that the signal's not loud enough to hit that ceiling. And remember, the job of a limiter is to just make sure that nothing past that level goes through. Well, if nothing is approaching that level, there's no work for the limiter to do. So why do we use a limiter? The limiter is here so that we can maximize or push as much volume out of our podcast without going over or distorting. So as you remember, going over 0 decibels, 0.0, is bad news. And when I say 0 decibel full scale, that really means the maximum amount that your audio interface and computer can handle. So going over that is really, really bad. It sounds awful, and it's impossible to repair no matter what kind of compressor you have. So if this is all about letting me increase the overall volume, then as I increase the gain, you will see the gain reduction meter start to kick in, because now the peaks are starting to approach the ceiling. Have a listen, watch the gain reduction meter. No expensive tools, no universal audio interfaces, nothing but a nice microphone, and you should have seen really quickly that the gain reduction meter kicked in ever so briefly, meaning the limiter was doing its job. It was protecting us from overload. But if this is already way down and none of these things are approaching the ceiling, why would I bother? Why do I care? Well, here's the thing. With podcasts, you don't want yours to be the quietest one on the internet. And in fact, some people believe you should push to try to be the loudest. Now, purists believe, and I include myself in that group, that if you squish your dynamics so much, for example, watch what happens if I push the gain way, way, way up. It's still going to squish and not let anything surpass that brick wall ceiling. But so much of the signal is going to be at that brick wall ceiling that it ends up compressing and squishing it, and it's not going to sound good. Have a listen. And a Tascam DR40 portable field recorder. This thing's loaded up with 3 AA batteries, and that's it. And I have my condenser microphone plugged straight into the device. No processing, no nothing. You may have noticed that sounds really, really harsh. And another thing, dynamic range refers to the difference between the loudest and the quietest parts of a signal. And yes, the last thing you want to have happen is the noise in your office or your car coming up to about here, meaning that you can hear this part of the audio signal fine, but anything that's really quiet can't be heard. So it is definitely important to maximize loudness to a point. Have a look at my meters with me. You'll notice at a more reasonable level that the difference between the average volume, which is where the needle is, and the maximum volume, which you'll see like a little tiny, I don't even know what the word for that is. Let's check it out. Nothing. So the purpose of this recording is, do you see that little thing, this little thing sliding up over here? It's like a secondary meter. That shows the peak. The best way to look at it is the average numbers are on the left and the peak numbers are on the right. Watch the distance between the two. Is to show you what it can sound like without using any expensive tools, just really easily available stuff. See, there's about 10 decibels, if you were noticing as it was playing, 10 decibels, or like a pretty good gap from here to here between the average signal and the peak signal. Watch what happens if I just crush it. That doesn't put you out a ton of your pocket money, so you can get started podcasting on the cheap and get great results. You see how the difference was about 5 decibels and like a very, very small margin between the average and the maximum peak? That's all techie speak for saying that the most interesting parts of the human voice are the ups and the downs and the quiets and the louds. It's part of communication. For you to squish all of that out, all of that dynamic range out, is not necessarily a good thing. So trying to get the loudest podcast that was ever made is not a noble pursuit. I believe that the best way to handle compression is use a character compressor to give your voice quality and tone. Use a limiter to make sure you can push the volume up and safeguard yourself against distortion. All right. So I just showed you how to do that with the built-in limiter. Let's try some different ones that are commercially available. Now remember, these are not supposed to impart any quality or character. So choose one that does the job well. This one's made by Brainworks and it does the exact same thing. Let's give it about 3.5 decibels of boost. And let's make sure that it's set to minus 0.5. All right, so that's my brick wall ceiling, and this is how much boost I'm going to give it to make sure that it's just starting to touch, but not to overstimulate that limiter circuit. All right, let's kick it in and have a listen. Just leave it out, and then I'll kick it in as I'm playing. So what I'll do is just record some short audio for that purpose today. And what I'll do is state the mission statement of my 2 podcasts. So the Badass Agile podcast exists to create an elite tribe of leaders. So you notice 2 things. Instantly when I turned it on, it made my podcast louder. The next thing it did is it barely touched the peaks. Only once in a while did you see the gain reduction meters kick in, and that's because I've set it with a generous amount of boost and a brick wall ceiling of very, very just below full scale. Now, if you don't like this one, you could also try Universal Audio has one, which is quite good and very transparent. And we'll do the same thing. We'll set it so that the ceiling is about minus 0.5 dB. And we're also boosting. Let's leave it at 0 boost. And you'll see here's the squish meters or the gain reduction meters here. In the beginning, you'll see they're doing nothing. As I increase this knob, you'll notice that the gain reduction meters start to work. Have a watch. Of leaders can take agile principles and bring them back to their leadership game, and then bring that leadership to their teams, to their clients, to their products, and to the world. The concept is that agile and great. Now you see some little bit of activity happening there. Now in reality, 3 decibels of gain reduction for a limiter is too much. You really want to shoot for about 1 decibel. So I'll bring this back down to a normal sane level of about 3 decibels of boost. And how, by the way, can you find out or figure out what the loudest part of your track is so that you can test it? Absolutely. In Logic, all you'd have to do is double click on your track and go to the file view. And there's a function called search peak. I'm going to change my view to bars and beats, and it looks like my peak is right around 22.4, so bar 22. So let's go back to bar 22, and let's just set it on repeat from 21 to 23 and watch what happens. And what I'll do is state the mission statement of my 2 podcasts. So the Badass Agile Pod. So right where it says badass is where the peak is. Let's set it up so that the compressor reacts to the word badass and reduces it at about 1 decibel right at that moment. Let's try it. And what I'll do is state the mission statement of my 2 podcasts. So the Badass Agile Pod. And what I'll do is, so right now the word badass made it clip at 1.13 decibels of gain reduction. Let's just take the boost down a touch so that it just makes it hit right around 1. And what I'll do is state the mission statement of my 2 podcasts. So the Badass Agile Pod. That's perfect. So at this point, you would know you're reasonably safe. I mean, you should listen to the entire audio file just to make sure, but that's a great way to make sure you have about 1 decibel of limiting at the absolute loudest part of the track. The reason why you don't want to push it more, well, if it's loud now, wouldn't louder be better? No, because then you're forcing the limiter to act on the signal more often and impart what might be an undesirable, like that limiting algorithm doesn't always sound good. A really good example of a limiting algorithm that may not sound good is Waves L1. This is a very popular type of limiter, and it's popular because it fidgets with frequencies and volume to try to get the maximum perceived volume possible out of a track, but it does so at a great cost. Let's have a listen to what happens if we use this kind of plugin with a minus 0.5 out ceiling and start dropping the threshold. Listen carefully to what it does. And what I'll do is state the mission statement of my 2 podcasts. So the Badass Agile Pod. And what I'll do is state the mission statement of my 2 podcasts. So the Badass Agile Pod. And what I'll do is, so the gain reduction meter's over here. You see it's just starting to work. And what I'll do is state the mission statement of my 2 podcasts. So the Badass. But once I start to move it down further and further, which a lot of people are tempted to do because this loudness, it's really addictive, it starts to worsen the tone. And what I'll do is state the mission statement of my 2 podcasts. So the Badass Agile Pod. And what I'll do is state the mission statement of my 2 podcasts. So the Badass. And look at what it's doing on the meters. Look at how close the average and the peak get, and watch the numbers to see the delta between the average and the peak as well. And what I'll do is state the mission statement of my 2 podcasts. So the Badass Agile Pod. And what I'll do is state the mission statement of my 2 podcasts. So I'm seeing not only terrible sound, but I'm also seeing that the difference between the average and the peak is very, very small. So I've effectively squished this to the point where it doesn't resemble my original voice anymore. So let's stick with one of those other limiters. Let's use I really like the BX one. Let's bring out the BX limiter. Let's kick this guy in. And let's see what it would sound like now without RVox and without the BX limiter. And then let's kick them both in and listen to hear the difference. Hello, everybody. Chris Williams here. I am recording a podcast today using no expensive tools, no universal audio interfaces, nothing but a nice microphone and a Tascam DR40 portable field. So I'm really happy with that because not only does it sound good, it doesn't have any distortion in it. I'm protected from overload. And if you happen to be watching the meters, my delta was around 10 to 11 decibels, which is perfect. And there's no tonal artifacts that I'm unhappy with. And the podcast is plenty loud. Now, by the way, if you ever get one of these meters that measures things in loudness units or LUFS, the target LUF for a podcast is between minus 16 and minus 18 LUFS long term or average. So let's see how my podcast is faring. Field recorder. This thing's loaded up with 3 AA batteries, and that's it.
and I have my condenser microphone plugged straight into the device.
So one could even say that my podcast is a bit loud. It should be between -16 and -18, and it's registering -14. So I could actually afford to go to my limiter and drop the gain even lower. Let's try 2.8 or so. Let's try it again and see where it registers.
To the device, no processing, no nothing.
I'll reset all that.
No nothing. So the purpose of this recording is to show you what it can sound like without using any expensive tools. Just really easily available stuff that doesn't put you out a ton of your pocket money, so you can get started.
All right, now that's getting more into the league. Now, is this a good way to master or finalize a podcast? No, you should always check with your ears. But I have to tell you, if you were making commercial recordings like commercials for on-air advertising, they have actual standards that say you cannot exceed this number because they're trying to control people making advertisements louder to make them more noticeable. So they actually have really strict rules about this in some areas of audio engineering. For us, you don't need to care about this number too much. But I would absolutely care about the distance between your average and your peak. And I would definitely make sure that nothing distorts. And I would definitely make sure that you can boost the overall volume of your podcast without squishing it. So that's why I like a limiter in conjunction with a compressor. Remember, compressor is for character and general smoothing of volume. Limiter is to make sure nothing distorts and blows past 0 decibels full scale. So using the two in conjunction is a powerful way to have a great sounding podcast that's as loud as it can be without compromising on audio quality. Hope that helps, guys. Try it for yourself on your own recordings and see. Talk to you next time.